Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to call to order a special City Commission meeting of July 15th, 2019. Our Commission Budget Workshop number 2. Mr. Parks, are you going to present?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioners. Welcome to the Commission Workshop number 2 for the preliminary budget presentation. Today we're going to talk about some of the budgetary trends from the prior years, the review of a projected fiscal year end for this year, 2019, review of the proposed operating budget for fiscal year 2020, and then we'll review the 4 largest department budgets, which take care of 73% of the city, and we'll also look at the rest compiled. At any point, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask. So the first slide that we're looking at is a historical look at our property value since 2009. As you see in 09, it was 11.7. We took a drop down all the way to 8.1 billion in fiscal year 2013. And then since then, we had a continuous increase in the property values to this year where we're at $13.6 billion in value. So in this, from 19 to 20, fiscal year 20, there's a $900 million increase in property values. The next slide is showing you our millage. As you can see, there is 2 millage rates. There's one that is associated with debt, which is our general obligation bond, and then the other is the operating amount of millage. So in 2011 fiscal year, we had 8.07. It increased to 8.3465 in fiscal year 13, and the operating millage has been the same ever since. The debt millage is related to the outstanding debt, so it fluctuates based on what is required to pay off the debt. So it went from 0.4 in fiscal year 11 down to 0.19, and then it went up to 0.204, and then it's been going down slightly ever since to extinguish the outstanding debt on the GO bond. So technically, every year since 2013, our tax rate has decreased slightly. This chart shows you the comparison of revenues and expenditures since 2009, and every year, typically the revenues are outpacing the expenditures, except it looks like in 2013, and where we are for proposed 2020, and this is still preliminary, but the blue being the revenues and the red being the expenditures. This slide shows you excuse me, the employees, the purple being the general fund employees and the red being all other funds. So if you look at the general fund employees in 2010, we were at 1,109, and projected in 2020, we would be at 1,156. In the all other funds, we had 441 in 2010, and we were up to 532 in 2020. So there was a decrease in the number of employees, again, associated with the drop in revenues and the recession. And as we began to recover, the number of employees recovered. And now we're at 1688, looks like. Here is the population chart. Everything tends to follow the same trend. We were higher in 2010, dropped in 2011, and then from 12 on, we started to grow in population, projected to be at about 114,000 in fiscal 2020.
Mr. Parks,
Yes,
quick
sir.
question. In non-census years, how do we come up with our population numbers?
This is a projection from, it's the University of Florida has an and the Department of Revenue, they do an estimate.
Okay,
So we use that for that.
thank you.
This shows where we are projecting to be for the end of this year, as well as what we are proposing so far for 2020, and then you see the actual numbers in fiscal year 2018. So as you may recall, in 2018, we had a significant amount of carry forward. There it shows that we actually came out about $3 million ahead of budget, which means our revenues exceeded the expenditures by that amount. And we adopted a budget of $186,430,000. Given all the carry forwards and additions to the budget, we are projecting that we would end at about $209 million in revenues and expenditures with maybe a $400,000 surplus at the end of the year. For 2020, at this point, we're projecting $190 million in general fund revenues, which is a $4 million increase from the prior year proposed budget. And the expenses are going up 11.28 million year over year, and that's a 6.1 increase. So if you look at the third from the last column, you'll see that there is a projected deficit at this point of about $7 million that we need to make up before we finish the budget cycle.
Mr. Parks,
Yes,
go
sir.
back to that previous slide, please.
Okay.
Our projected expenses for this year is $209 million. What scares me is that we're proposing expenses which are, what, $12 million below what we spent. Is that an accurate assessment? Are we really cutting $12 million of expenses out, projected thus far?
What the 2009 is, it includes dollars that were taken from fund balance or for sales of property. So it was additional proceeds that came in. But the 190 or the 186 was the actual level. So if you were looking at year over year,
Okay.
a better comparison would be adopted to proposed.
Okay. Thank you.
And here is the revenue summary comparison, starting again with the actual 2018. We had $191.63 million in actual revenues, and we're taking that out to fiscal year 2020. And to your point, Mayor, you see that the 2020 proposed is slightly less than what was the actual in 2018. So there is slightly lower than it has been. But the two prior years, you see that there was a modified budget based on monies that was pulled from the fund balance or other proceeds. So this is just straight revenues based on what we project we'll bring in from all our revenue sources. And again, that's an increase of $4.1 million. The primary place where that came from is the property taxes. If you look at the first row, you see that property taxes went up 4.1, and that's primarily the increase. There's some ins and outs, but basically that's the increase. This explains the increase. We had a 4.79 million increase in property taxes gross. Of that, we had a decrease in delinquent taxes. We get very little money, or quite honestly none, from delinquent taxes anymore. That used to be about $2 million, but now last year it came in at about 80,000, and next year we are expecting much less. So the net property tax increase is 4.12. We had 2.91 increase in charges for services, 560,000 in intergovernmental, and then we had decreases in licensing and permits. And also, we mentioned that there would be not a significant amount of carry forward for this year. And then we had a slight increase in other revenues of about $760,000. This is just showing you the breakdown of the percentages of our revenues, property taxes being the largest part, 4.3 million, charges for service at 21.7, other taxes 10.7, 8.3 for license and permits, and then everything else. Let's see here on this slide. Okay, here we look at the expenditures. So the first line is personnel. As you know, that's the largest item on our budget. And from our projected, which is about 124 million for 19, we're going up to 130 million projected in personnel. So the difference that you see, the 9.83, is proposed compared to the adopted budget. So it's a $9.8 million increase in personnel. In materials and services, it went up slightly at 1.46 million. Internal services, which is IT, accounting, fleet, et cetera, went up 1.15 million.
Excuse me, Mr. Parks, we have a question from Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't know if it's pertinent to all expenses, but certainly in personnel and just as a way to further comprehend, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that our population grew. And in some of our numbers, I was looking back at our employees versus our spend. And so when we're looking at our expenses, I think sometimes we forget that our population has grown at the same time. So if there's a way to present this, even when we get out to the community on a per capita basis, to say how many employees per capita, what is our expense per capita, so that way we don't lose track of the fact that it's not a stagnant number of people that we're serving along the line, that our population has grown, so therefore expenses would grow, and I've done the numbers, they kind of grow at the same pace. So our expenses grow as our population grows. If there's a way that we can further display that, that would be really helpful.
We absolutely can do that.
Thank you.
And the other thing you may want to consider, and we were talking about this the other day, is even years ago, if you look at 2009, you look at the personnel expenses, you compare it to today, if it's not adjusted based on inflation and increases in salary, then it's not the same. So, you have to factor in those type of things as well. But we certainly can do a per capita number with that.
It's a very good point.
Okay. Materials and services, as I said, went up 1.46, internal services 1.15, slight decrease in capital spending, debt service went up slightly, 0 change in grants, and then our transfers went down $1.19 million. So our expenses went up $11.28 million. Again, primarily due to personnel. So here's the breakdown. Personnel went up 9.83. That was a 2.3 million was the 3% cost of living increase. 3.1 million was positions added. 0.4 reduction is just pay reductions based on vacancies and turnovers. There was a 3.9 million increase for police and firefighter pensions and VEBA. $500,000 increase in overtime, and a $400,000 increase in firefighter special pays. Materials and services, contracts and professional service went up about $810,000. Electric and water, $120,000, about $300,000 decrease in economic development, and equipment maintenance up $940,000, and then small decrease and increase in waste disposal and other materials and services. In the other expenditures, the big increase was IT maintenance, increased almost $1 million. Radio system charges increased, and then we had an increase in telecommunications. Our insurance and general liability actually went down a little over $500,000. Capital outlay, small variance, same thing with debt service, and then we had a a decrease in the amount of transfers due to OPEB. And this shows the expenditures, percentage 66.2 of personnel, 19.1 materials and services, 7.7 internal services, and then debt services about 6% of the expenditures. So now we're going to look at the largest 4 departments, and that's police, fire, parks and recreation, and public works. Now, if you look at this slide, if you look at police, for instance, you'll see the change after the yellow column, which is 2020 proposed, is a $5 million increase, and that's primarily due to personnel. The same goes for fire, went up 3.8 million, and then parks and rec went up about 1.23. Now, again, fire and police are primarily personnel, so keep in mind those are not going away. Those will be continuing expenses, and it will probably increase close to that every year moving forward.
Mr. Parks, on that point, do we have a breakdown of the nature of the personnel expenses that go into that $5 million increase? In other words, is it overtime? Is it increased personnel?
Yes, it's,
We'll get to that slide later.
yeah.
There is a chart? Okay.
Yes, there is,
That's
yes.
fine. If it's coming up, that's fine.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mayor. The question I have is, so I kind of went through it, and I don't see it, so I don't know if you're going to be addressing this, but the $3.1 million in the added positions. I know you're going to be talking about the 4 largest departments, but do you, at some point, when do we dig into or get a chance to see what is made up of that $3.1 million in personnel for the positions added in this new fiscal year? Is that when we get our budget books? When do we?
Basically,
Because I don't know necessarily that, I mean, I think it's practical and important to go over the 4 largest departments, but I mean, in terms of that number,
Right.
I don't see it addressed in here. So when is that going to be addressed?
We could provide that, but let me go through this and you'll see the increase in, so what the chart you're looking at right now shows you police, what percentage of the budget they are, fire, what percentage they are. So those 2 agencies come up to about 55.5% of the budget. Then you have Public Works at 8.4 and Parks and Rec at about 10%. So everybody else is 26%, and we'll go over that. You'll see that, and you can kind of see how it offsets personnel and all the increases in expenses.
And before you leave that slide, I think it's important to note, and we talk about this, that police and fire, their combined expenses exceed what we're bringing in from ad valorem taxes.
Correct.
And that's consistent every year.
Exactly. So we talked about that number right there. is
$109 million.
Yeah, exactly.
And we bring in 90-something
It was 90
ad
million.
valorem taxes?
It was 90 million, correct.
Yeah. That's the challenge we have.
Exactly. So here's the breakdown for police. So again, personnel services went up 3.56, and we will break that number down, 3.56 million. Materials and service at about 550,000, almost $1 million for internal services. Capital and debt service is negligible. So really it's personnel, materials and services, and internal services. Police, from year over year, they only added 3 FTEs from proposed last year and where we're proposing next year. So the increase of 5.1 million includes 911,000 in salaries, 183,000 in benefits, 525,000 in overtime and holiday pay, and then almost a $2 million increase in police pensions and VIVA. Then we had the Real-Time Crime Center at $449,000, materials and service, $104,000, and internal service funds at $975,000. Debt decreased slightly on vehicles. And then we have a Pell Grant, which is negligible. So that's where it happened. And then talk about the revenues. Revenues decreased by $288,000. Everything decreased, 55,000 court fines, 14,000 false alarms, 206,000 in dispatch, and then water catchment went down about $14,000. So expenditures went up, revenue went down, and the biggest piece is the pension. So part of the
Before you go to that, Commissioner Schoaf has a question.
Thank you. Just flipping back when we were on expenditures, I'm looking at your pie chart that shows 2020 proposed expenditures by source, and there's personnel services of 130 million, and then when we look at the four largest departments, those four largest departments make up 146 million. So I think I'm just looking for some clarification because I don't think I have something correct.
Okay, I'm sorry, which slide are you looking at?
Back a pie chart. The one that says FY 2020 proposed expenditures by source at the top. So back one slide from that.
Let's see.
There you go. So personnel services are coming in at 130, right? And then on the next slide, when we're looking at, that's total personnel services. And then when we're looking at the next slide on FY 2020, just the four largest departments are adding up to 146.
What's that?
It's the total expenses for those departments, not just personnel.
Right, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Let me clarify something. Even though I mentioned that our ad valorem taxes don't cover police and fire, that was not to be critical of those departments. It was to emphasize, I guess, the challenge that we have as those who are putting together the budget each year. I mean, we've got to provide our citizens with police protection and fire protection. That's not an option.
Right.
So, so again, it was not to be critical of those departments. It was just to emphasize the challenge.
Okay. Okay, so here's the fire department, which is 23% of the budget. The personnel services went up $2.7 million, materials and service, $860,000. The internal services went up about $60,000, and then we had debt service up about $130,000. That total increase is $3.78 million, and they only increased by 6 positions year over year. The breakdown is increases $649,000 salaries and wages. We lost grants of $185,000. Then there was a $310,000 increase in special pays and incentives, and then $1.9 million in firefighter pensions. So the big numbers in both is the increase in pensions.
Mr. Parks, could you maybe break that down? Is that increase in pensions because of more personnel? Because I know we did this pension bond a few years ago to cover ourselves, at least for the unpaid
Right.
portion. But give us some indications why the pension costs have increased and will probably continue to increase over time.
So there's a couple of things that are involved in the pension. The one is, of course, the amount of salaries. So as salaries goes up, the cost of pensions will go up. So even with the overtime, that's factored in, so that increases the cost. As you may recall, we changed the way fire calculates overtime. So that made that number bigger. I think it was, I don't know, $2 million a year of more overtime just based on the same number of hours. And then we also increased what's called the multiplier for police. And what that is how they factor and calculate their pensions. We went from 2.75 multiplier to 3.0. So that increased the long-term liability for police pensions. And the other is something that has been happening pretty much nationwide, is we lowered the assumed rate of the investments. Because of the way the stock market is going, all the police and fire both were at 8% assumed return on investment for the portfolio. That was lowered. Police, I believe, is at 7.75 now, and fire is right about there. So as you factor that in, the three numbers are that multiplier, the investments, and then also the amount of money that the people kick in. So that would factor into why that number is going to be higher. So it shouldn't be, because the multiplier, I would assume, won't be increasing again. That number should be pretty constant. And the same with the overtime. So that's a one-time increase. It shouldn't be that large of an increase moving forward.
Mayor, can I weigh in on that? Just
Yes.
to Mark's point, the way to think about the investment, because that is the largest piece of this, is the decline in the investment rate. Basically the way the pension works is, how much money do you have to put away today to pay the pensions on the back end? If you only earn 1% a year, then you have to put a lot more money up front. My understanding of the pension plans is that there is another planned decrease in the investment rate this next year coming up. So I would anticipate that after this year, we'll have another year where these kind of pension increases will have to be absorbed. And, that's just a challenge that we have. That's decided by the pension board, not by the city.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it was fire took theirs down over a 4-year, incremental drop. And then police went down, I may be mixing them up, but they went down at 7.5 from 8. So one is taking it in steps and the other just took it all at once. So that's that assumed investment return.
Tangentially rated, but before we move off of here, is the legislature passed at the last session a provision whereby we have to, the firefighters receive the presumption that there's to be cancer coverage. How will that impact our budget? Will that now increase this number in years going forward? Do we have some kind of insurance to protect us on that?
We budgeted 50,000 for that. It doesn't impact pension.
Yeah, it won't affect the pension, and it's,
It would affect the general budget.
it may affect the budget, and we use past experience, and this year we budgeted 50,000. It's based on, prior claims that we've seen. So we've seen maybe 2, in the recent past. And the legislature has really not, in our opinion, finished the legislation, because we're not sure if they're going to make it retro or, how they're going to make it work. But if it's just from this point moving forward, then it shouldn't be a super large impact. Maybe $100,000, $200,000 every other year or something. It shouldn't be anything that would be extreme, I would think.
All right. Madam Attorney, you want to weigh in?
I'll go ahead while you continue talking about the agenda and pull up the items so that we can have the specifics of the requirements of the bill. My recollection, it is retroactive, but I want to look.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then here's the expenditure increases, fire maintenance, and Mayor, but I'm not sure if the commission knows that we brought over fire equipment maintenance from the county to within the city. And part of the challenge is some of the vehicles are so old that the expenditures are very large. It's been hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment maintenance for these old vehicles. So we're really trying to move forward and purchase some new vehicles, which would help that number. Then contractual services went up, travel and training, and then we've leased some vehicles. That's the other larger number at 131,000 increase in principal and interest for leased vehicles. So here's the highlights, the revenues of 6.1 million, just the increase of about 300,000. EMS increase, false alarms, fire protection, so they all went up slightly. So we did have a slight increase in revenues from the fire department. Here's Parks and Recreation. It's basically flat. I mean, if you look at it, you got a 260,000 increase in personnel, another 240 in materials and services. Internal services went up about 700,000. So their total went up 1.25 million, and they added a quarter of a person. Not any real big variances on this side. And that just goes into it. The salary went up, outsourced right-of-way moving, internal services went up significantly, and then general liability insurance, and then other operating decreased slightly. Revenues of 925,000 is the 5%, and it decreased by 41,000. And that's detailed there. So we got a big drop in athletic programs, and then you have smaller drops in swimming, dance, and tennis. Slight increase in trailer boat or boat trailer parking, and then field permits. And here's Public Works. Similar to Parks and Recreation, no major changes, a slight change in personnel. And then we have decreases throughout the rest of the budget. They added 12 FTEs, so even though they added a significant amount of people, there was no major impact on the budget. They actually went down in cost. And there's the breakdown, increase in salaries and health and workers' compensation, and then decreases in waste disposal, fuel, contracting, and then a slight increase in equipment cost. Okay. So here are the other departments. So this is everything combined. And as you see, it went up $1.2 million. So, I mean, if you just want to use a percentage, maybe 50% of that was increases in personnel costs, which would take you at about $500,000. I mean, so if there weren't any large increases in personnel in all the other departments. That's it. So at this point, what we will do is continue to refine the projections, review planned purchases, and we need to revisit departments for additional savings.
So if my recollection is correct, we've got to make up about $7 million
That's correct.
to balance this budget. Okay. Questions? Yes, Commissioner Nairn.
Thank you. So, thanks, Mr. Parks, for the presentation. So just kind of going back to that initial question that I asked, the $3.1 million in the positions added, I think is roughly 26 positions with, you know, with my sketchy math, it's about $119,000 per position. Where do we see that? Where do we see where those positions are located throughout the city?
Okay, I can explain. Linda McDermott, Budget Manager. Throughout the year, from October 1st through now, we add positions, take away positions, we make adjustments. So from October 1st of last year, we've added 26.5 positions to the budget. So that's what's elevated our cost of personnel as well. 12 of those positions, I can tell you, were Public Works, but they also enhanced their revenue to cover those. Okay, then we did have changes in the mayor's office. We had 3 at police, and we had salary upgrades. In order to bring salaries up for the compression study and the minimum wage. That was a great deal also besides the 3%. But the 26.5 positions are changes since October 1 of 2018.
Mayor?
Yes.
Okay, just because I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it. And there's no opinion on this, it's just wanting the information to be out there. So this is the proposed budget for 2019, 2020.
Yes.
October 1st of 19 through September 30th of 2020.
Yes.
And as a part of that, it's saying in personnel service, there's an increase of 9.83 million. And of that, 3.1 million is positions added. You're saying they're currently in this budget?
Yes. Yes. Through, when we present to you through our agenda items, different changes through the years,
Right,
whether
I'm
they be
familiar with that.
personnel or anything else, okay? That is going to add to the prior year adopted. So what we're looking at here is we're comparing prior year adopted to the 2020. So in order to do that comparison, we have to now add and subtract all of those changes in between, so that's why it's 26.5 positions.
Okay.
Any follow-up?
Not at this time.
All right. Commissioner Lambert, Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. I know that we've talked about maybe a mid-year or a quarterly check-in on our budget in the past. You know, I think specifically as it relates to the 4 largest departments and maybe personnel services, maybe that's where we start as far as updates, just so that we know midway through the year where we are in these areas.
Yes, Mr. Parks and I have talked about that, and we look forward to that, actually.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, let me go down
Okay.
to Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you, Mayor. I didn't know which way we were pointing. 2 questions, actually. I remember last year when we went over the revenues, it was really stressed that we had a one-time revenue from the sale of City Hall, which of course will not be in this year. Can you tell me where that's reflected? I'm imagining we're looking at the general fund revenues. That was under miscellaneous, if I recall.
It actually was in prior. You won't see it here.
Okay.
Yeah, you won't see any of that reflected because that was in the prior.
So it was the previous year
Right.
reflection. Okay. And then the second question is more of a general question. As we have budget meetings coming up, I'm getting a lot of questions from citizens. Are my concerts in Curry Park budgeted for next year? Where can citizens go to find that level of detail as to what's in the budget for next year?
Parks and Recreation has events, and that would be part of their events if it's the Curry Park.
Sure. I guess that was just an example as a whole. If I want to know what parks events are, any kind of
Yeah, we have 2
activities.
different, we have the waterfront, which is a different fund. It's not the general fund. And they take in revenues to offset their expenditures for things like Fourth on Flagler, various things. The CRA also has some that they offer, which you're not seeing here. But then Curry Park, I think that began like last year. So that is in the general fund, Parks and Rec right now.
So to clarify, if I'm a citizen, where do I go to find that information?
So every year we do the budget book, which is like a book, and it's got pictures in that. And then we also provide the detail, which is about 800 pages, and it details every line item. It's not pretty, it's just basically a computer printout that shows every line for every department. So in there, it would show what Parks and Rec's budget consists of, and it would have things like Curry Park and, you know, the different events that they have.
So online under finance on WPB.org, they can find that detail of the budget and at least get to a point where it may not say specifically what they're looking for, but it may say Curry Park activities, waterfront activities, something along that line where they can see that there is funds allocated for public events.
Right, and it's very detailed, so it may say Curry Park concert
Okay.
specifically.
And will that be up before the budget meetings from the community?
That would be, no, it will not. That comes out for the budget hearings in September. So that's
Okay.
available at that point.
Is there a place currently that, so instead of sending residents specific question by specific question and saying, please contact Parks and see if it's in there, is there anywhere now that they can go to understand what's in the budget at the detail level?
Well, we could run it, Linda said, we could run it at any point, it's just not complete. I mean, it's not finalized, but it's something we could run at any given point.
I'll defer to the mayor as to what information he wants to disseminate now.
Well, if you have or you encounter specific questions like that, if you want to run them by the commission liaison, Tiffany, where is she? We could certainly try to track down that information even in advance.
Okay,
I mean, if if there are some specific inquiries.
sure. I just needed a resource. Thank you.
Yeah, no. But, Commissioner Rouse, did you have a, okay. Okay, Commissioner Neri?
Thank you. Given that Chief Adderley has been on about 30 days, do we anticipate, changes, or is this a pretty cooked proposed budget for the police department? Or
At this point, everything's in discussion, so this is not the final budget by any
right.
means, yes.
So that obviously is very fluid with him, I'd imagine scrubbing the budget and taking a look at his needs for the department, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think all the departments are taking a hard look and sharpening their pencils, so.
Exactly.
Okay, yes, Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. I know that at our last budget workshop a few weeks ago, we talked about the neighborhood budget meetings. And I mentioned that based on last year's budget meetings, there was some suggestions for more opportunities for collaboration and brainstorming from the residents. Can you just describe what residents can expect at these upcoming community meetings? And so should they look at a website ahead of time and prepare their questions? What should they do? What should they expect?
So one thing that has been implemented is in place, right? So Kathleen, the communications person, has set up a website where people could ask us questions. So they could email us questions and we would have those in advance of that presentation. So we'll have the opportunity to research or whatever and be able to address those questions once we go out into the field. The other thing that we've done to change those presentations, it used to be just the budget staff and we would present the general fund budget, which quite honestly is not necessarily what everyone was concerned about. So now we have John Ward joining us in a lot of those, and he talks about the CRA and the districts that are in the CRA. We have Kevin, who comes and talks about the capital projects. So we have a more complete team to answer all the questions. And that's it so far. And the other thing that we do and we have done is we always write down the requests that we receive at the budget meetings. We take them back to the mayor, and the mayor has that option to address it or not. And in the past, there have been things that have been asked for that we provided, and we came back the next year and said, you asked for this, and you got this. So those are some of the things that we do.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a web page on the website that's dedicated, so WPB.org, I guess, hopefully it's prominently displayed where they could provide not only questions, but any suggestions that they may have on the budget, which is, soliciting direct input from citizens. And I think that should also list, there's an email address too, but I don't have it. I think it's mybudgetinput@wp.org, but don't quote me on that. But it should be on that web page where people can email us directly, email the city directly. And thank you for that question, because the objective obviously is to make it a much more interactive experience than it has been in the past. So, you have a follow-up?
I do.
Okay.
Is that okay? Mayor, if it would be okay, I'm curious if we as commissioners could get that list that the residents have come up with, and as follow-up to them, to know which ones did get funded and which ones didn't, so that then we're aware when setting strategic priorities, maybe what might be funded in following years.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, Mr. Parks, thank you. Very, very fine presentation. Thank you. So we are adjourned until 4:45. That's a time certain, correct? For the special city commission meeting. That's time certain?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we're adjourned for 4:45. Thank you.